Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on PCI DSS and PA DSS. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ControlCase. Thank you for taking the time today to attend this webinar series by ControlCase on various IT compliance and security topics. A few housekeeping items before we get started. As we go through the session today, which should last anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes, please feel free to put something in the chat window if something is not audible or visible. You should all be able to see my screen now, and you should all be able to hear me properly. And as we go through the webinar today, if you do find any audio or visual difficulties, please put it in the chat window. Also, as we go through our agenda today, which is PCI DSS, PA DSS, segmentation, and data discovery, certainly feel free to put any questions that you have in the questions window, and we will answer them in the order we receive them. I think it is also okay to put in any questions that may not be related directly to segmentation or data discovery or the specific PCI and PA DSS topics we are talking today, but more generally on PCI DSS, PA DSS, or in IT compliance in general. Again, please feel free to put them in the window, in the questions window. A full recording of this webinar and these slides will all be available to you early next week. We'll be emailing them to you, and you will have a copy of these slides as well as a recording of this webinar. Also, feel free to log on to our website, www.controlcase.com, to sign up for other future webinars or see recordings as well as slideshows of any prior webinars that we have had over the past many years. That being said, again, thank you for your time to attend this webinar on PCI DSS and PA DSS. Our agenda today will be, for those of you who are new to PCI DSS and PA DSS, to talk a little bit about it. We will then talk about some of the more hotly questioned topics in PCI DSS and topics where there are a lot of questions and lack of clarity sometimes, which will include segmentation and penetration testing. We'll also talk about card data discovery and how it ties back to PCI DSS and PA DSS. And as I mentioned, as we go along, just feel free to put things in the questions window and we will answer them. About PCI DSS. So PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. These are basically standards that have been put together by the PCI Council, PCI Security Standards Council, which was established more than a decade back as a consortium from leading payment card brands such as Visa, MasterCard, and so forth. And it basically establishes a set of standards to protect card data. So any entities that store, process, or transmit card data in the entire payment chain really have applicability when it comes to PCI DSS. As you can imagine, merchants, acquirers, issuers, service providers, all these entities come in touch with card data when it comes to processing, storing, or transmitting in some way, form, or shape, and hence PCI DSS would apply there. PCI DSS requirements span across 12 sub-requirements along 6 main areas. One is around maintaining and building a secure network, things like firewalls and configurations. Number 2 is protecting cardholder data, and that is both in storage as well as transmission. Talks about things like encryption and so forth. Third is maintaining a vulnerability management program, which includes things like anti-malware and ensuring that applications are developed taking into account OWASP vulnerabilities and other application vulnerabilities that may exist out there. Number 4 is implementing strong access control measures. This would be both logical as well as physical security access control measures. and would include things like username, passwords, but also things like physical security controls to include badge readers, cameras, and so forth. The next one is monitoring and testing networks, and this would include vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, logging and monitoring, file integrity monitoring, and a lot of technical controls that establish detective as well as preventive controls from a perspective of ensuring cardholder data security. And finally, maintaining an information security policy, which includes policies, training, vendor management, and other areas such as that. So that is a high level of the PCI DSS requirements. That's the way they have existed. I'll talk a little bit about PCI DSS 3.2.1, which has been in place starting 2019. And some of the areas are main areas where things have changed because the grandfathering of various controls, that time frame has passed. So number one, there have been various areas where SSL and early TLS migration timelines have passed. So really everything should now be in a secure TLS method. And so Appendix A2 has been removed in that sense. Various requirements that allow for POS, POI to be on older versions have also been updated so that only the ones that are not susceptible to known exploits, obviously, are allowed to still be in place. The others absolutely have to be replaced. And then there are various other requirements which had an effective date of February 1, 2018, such as two-factor authentication for various types of access. Those dates have passed, and so everything that was going to come in place for 3.2 is now very much in place. So that was a high level of PCI DSS, and specifically PCI DSS 3.2.1, which was basically an acknowledgement of the fact that for any of the controls where there were timelines allowed for grandfathering those controls in have now passed, and so there is no more timelines for any of the original 3.2 controls. Let's talk about the second regulation we want to talk about, which is PADSS, or Payment Applications. Just the way PCI DSS applies to infrastructure, Payment Applications applies to actual software that is installed by customers. So this applies to commercial payment applications that are sold and installed off the shelf. So these are software codes that are installed by customers, and those customers could be merchants and acquirers in their environment. It has to be an application. It does not apply to things like operating systems, database systems, back office systems, and so forth. And so as you're talking about applications, the requirements are more software focused and functionality focused. I will not go through the entire list, but I'll give you a few examples here which are kind of relevant here. Obviously, you will have a copy of this slide so you can look through it. If you look at requirement number 5, it's making sure you have secure payment applications. If you look at requirement number 1, ensuring that the actual application does not store card data, especially things like track data. And if it does store card data, it should be in a secure manner. Certainly requirement number 14, which establishes a process for ensuring that training and deployment of this software is done in a PCI DSS compliant manner. And requirement number 13 and 14 talk about that. Requirement number 6 talks about wireless transmission, which ensures that the application, to the degree it supports wireless, it should be in a secure manner. And so the actual PADSS requirements span across 14 different requirements. So that was a high level on PCI DSS, which is the infrastructure and establishes controls over an environment that stores, processes, and transmits card data. Then we talked about the payment application, which is really a set of controls over the actual software that is purchased off the shelf and installed at customers. And that's how PCI DSS and PA DSS apply to the overall ecosystem. Our next topic of discussion would be in the context of PCI DSS, and we will talk about segmentation and penetration testing, which are closely related. So let's start with what is network segmentation. When you isolate cardholder data environment systems from non-cardholder data environment systems using a variety of techniques that are possible, whenever that is done in the network or for a company, that's what network segmentation is. And the key thing to always remember about network segmentation is that network segmentation is not a mandatory requirement of PCI DSS. However, if you want to reduce scope, that's typically when network segmentation is used to reduce scope and separate out the cardholder data environment from the non-cardholder data environment. And so sometimes that becomes confusing, as we have seen across our customer base. And we wanted to ensure that is clear that it is not a mandatory requirement, but it does help reduce scope of cardholder data environment. Let's talk a little bit more about network segmentation. So you always, if you have implemented or you know of a customer that has implemented segmentation, there is certainly the cardholder data environment, or the CDE, that either stores, processes, or transmits card data. What is in scope are both the systems that are connected to the cardholder data environment with persistent connectivity, and any systems that provide security to the cardholder data environment. For example, Active Directory, which provides, logical access. What is also included is something that might impact the security. For example, if there are management networks that impact the security of the cardholder data environment as well as other environments, those are environments that do impact security and do form in scope for PCI DSS. And then finally, any technologies or controls that actually provide the segmentation, and this could be network access control, this could be firewalls, or a combination thereof, all form in scope of a PCI DSS environment when the network is segmented. So the cardholder data environment plus all these different rings around the cardholder data environment form part of the scope of PCI DSS. When we talk about segmentation, let me give a few more examples here. Here's an example of a flat network where there are cardholder servers, but there are also development servers and users all on a single flat network. And in this case, everything will be in scope. The next one is an example of a segmented network example. In this example, there is a virtual tunnel between the finance users on the left-hand side of the screen and the cardholder servers on the right-hand side of the screen. And in this case, the finance users, the firewall, the core switch, and the cardholder data servers come in scope of PCI DSS because that is the segment that relates to storing, processing, or transmitting card data. The other users, infrastructure servers, and development servers in this example would not be in scope for the PCI DSS validation and certification. And this is just an example of how a company would have reduced scope by segmenting networks. So we talked about segmentation. Now let's talk about penetration test, and then we'll talk about segmentation penetration test. So what is the penetration test? Again, when we talk about PCI DSS specifically, or in IT compliance in general, there are two terminologies we use often. One is vulnerability scanning, and one is penetration test. So vulnerability scanning involves basically automated scans and tests that are run from a company through automated scanners like Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable Nessus, and so forth that identify possible vulnerabilities that may exist in the network. And so those are automated tests which identify possible vulnerabilities. A penetration test actually involves an actual individual or a team of people who will test out vulnerabilities in a network to see whether those vulnerabilities actually are exploitable, or if a combination of those vulnerabilities is actually exploitable. And so the penetration test is not an automated activity. It is actually a manual activity of security experts testing beyond vulnerability scanning the security of an environment by seeing which vulnerabilities are actually exploitable. And this could be done from the inside. This could be done from the outside. It is obviously, there are two aspects to this. One, it is required by PCI DSS. And number two, as you can imagine, it's extremely important because while automated scanners go so far, nothing out there replaces a human emulating an active hacker and trying to see if an environment is susceptible to exploitation. So that is why it is important. Typically, what should we include in the test? So here is where you talk about three types of tests that could be included. One is the internal penetration test, which is emulating someone from the internal network trying to get cardholder data. External penetration test, which is someone from the outside, from the internet, that is trying to get cardholder data. And then third is segmentation penetration test, which is to ensure that the segmentation is actually working as implemented, and that it is in fact reducing the scope and ensuring that the cardholder data environment and the PCI scope is proper. So there is internal, external, and segmentation. And then within each of these, you have both the network layer and the application layer. Segmentation verification. So again, the segmentation piece of the penetration test makes sure that companies are testing on an ongoing basis that systems that are deemed out of scope because they have appropriate segmentation controls in place are actually out of scope. This could mean doing things like port scans from the outside to see that non-CD systems cannot access CD systems. It could be the other way, which is ensuring that the CDE systems do not have any direct connectivity to the outside CDE systems and are transferring card data. More often than not, this would involve the tester knowing about what is the proposed segmentation technology and architecture, and really using the tests to validate that those technologies are working appropriately. Here are some of the methodologies for penetration tests that you want to refer to as some standard methods that could help your organization go in a more systemic manner through a penetration test. The open source security testing methodology, the OWASP or the Open Web Application Security Project, and so forth are good methodologies that can be used as a base for penetration testing. And again, as I said, they cover testing both from internal and external. It includes segmentation pen test, and it includes both the network layer and the penetration and the application layer. When we do a segmentation penetration test for an environment, it is important that we come out with a clear result that has the segmentation passed or has the segmentation pen test failed. Because if the segmentation pen test has failed, it means the scope has not been defined correctly. So either the segmentation needs to be fixed or the entire network needs to be gotten into PCI scope. So it is important that this firm result come out of a segmentation penetration test result. And the best results to best practices are, we talked about a few things in the past, but things like unused firewall rule sets to the extent firewalls are being used for segmentation. Access from one segment to the other from an ACL perspective. More periodic rule set reviews. These are types of things that should be done to ensure that segmentation is happening properly so that there's a higher probability of passing a segmentation penetration test. So this gets us to our last part of our presentation. We talked about PCI DSS and how PCI DSS applies to an infrastructure and an environment. We talked about PADSS, which applies to a software. We talked about segmentation pen test and penetration test in general, as well as segmentation, to talk about how scope can be reduced and how penetration test can be used to ensure that the reduced scope using segmentation is working appropriately. We're going to touch on the last topic of this deep dive from a PCI DSS and PADSS perspective, which is card data discovery and its implications to memory. So what is card data discovery? When we're talking about PCI DSS, PADSS, we're talking about card data. And so discovery in that context makes reference to ensuring that we are able to pinpoint where data lies across the infrastructure. Why is it important? We're doing PCI DSS and PADSS to protect cardholder data. Well, to protect data, you need to know where it is, and hence data discovery is important to identify where this data actually resides. Requirement 3 of PCI DSS mandates that stored data, to the extent card data is stored, it should be encrypted and protected. And there are PCI Council advisories on ensuring that when we do scoping and when we do descope networks, it is important to make sure that there is no unknown cardholder data lying outside the PCI DSS scope. So it is important to know that we know that we verify that we know where the cardholder data lies, but there needs to be a process to ensure that there is no unknown data lying somewhere as well. And that is why PCI DSS is extremely important. There are various methods for data discovery. These could be DLP solutions, card data discovery solutions, manual scripts, as well as forensic technologies out there. Key things to look at when you do data discovery planning is, number one, you want to make sure that you look at your architecture and see whether you want to do agent based on the architecture, an agent-based or an agent-less implementation. So that's an important piece to kind of look at as you go through it. The second piece is ensuring that you are using things like Lund's formula to narrow down false positives. You're making sure that you're planning to ensure that performance does not affect production systems. If you have a tokenized environment, the ability to distinguish between tokens and real card numbers, and then the ability to exclude certain environments that will give false positives. So PCI DSS, when we talk about PCI DSS, we talked about a lot of areas such as scope, ensuring cardholder data is appropriately looked for. When we talk about PADSS, certainly any applications should also have the ability to ensure that A, they don't store sensitive data, so things like track data and all should not be stored post-authorization. Things like card numbers, if they are stored, should be stored with encryption. But the PADSS also puts an additional requirement around ensuring that card data in memory must be handled appropriately, so that there is no, so that memory scraping attacks that look at the memory of various devices, especially things like point-of-sale devices, are appropriately nullified once a transaction is complete, so that the memory of these devices does not have a lot of card data unencrypted, susceptible to memory scraping attacks lying in there. We now get into the Q&A sessions, and we will now answer any questions that you may have. Just to summarize, we talked about PCI DSS, which talks about the entire payment card industry environment, PA DSS, which is the Payment Application Data Security Standard. Then we talked about penetration testing, segmentation, and an intersection of that, which is segmentation penetration testing. And finally, we talked about card data discovery in the context of PCI DSS and PA DSS. At this point, if you have any questions, please type them in the questions window, and I will answer them in the order we receive them. The first question we have is, as a software vendor, which one applies, PCI DSS or PA DSS? So if you are a vendor that provides software which is installed at a customer site, then PA DSS will apply. If you are a vendor that provides software as a service and the customer doesn't have to install anything on their end, then PCI DSS will apply. If your software platform includes both a software as a service component or option and a service component and option that installed on the customer side, then both will apply. So hopefully that clarifies which of these areas apply when you talk about PCI DSS and PA DSS. The second question is around card data discovery and talking about what to do once once a card data discovery project has been completed. So once a card data discovery project has been completed, there are a couple of areas that can happen from there. One is that you knew the scope of where the cardholder data environment lied. Number two, that you found cardholder data outside the scope of where you had expected. If you did find card data in the area where you expected it and it's appropriately protected, then that's good. Your segmentation and CDE is working fine. If you found data outside that environment, certainly you want to make sure that it is removed or your scope extended to include protection of that data. The next question is, as a cloud provider, how should you be protecting customers who may be storing credit card information in your systems? So as a cloud provider, first of all, the way you should be protecting is by ensuring you are implementing all controls of PCI DSS properly at the highest level. Specifically, if you're storing credit card information, it should be encrypted and then access controlled in an appropriate manner. The next question is, talks about secure coding. As a software vendor, is it important? And how do we get secure coding certification? So, I touched a little bit on OWASP and on application security, but this is a good question. So if you're a software vendor, certainly secure coding needs to be a part of your development process and your quality assurance process. And getting certification for that really involves two components. One is making sure you are running scans against your code to ensure they're not susceptible to things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. And number two, ensuring your developers are both developers and folks who do quality assurance know the secure coding standards so they can write and evaluate code against those standards. The next question is, does network segmentation apply in PA DSS or is it just for PCI DSS? And the answer would be, it is primarily just for PCI DSS because it's an environment-related issue. The next question is, what would be a good strategy for quarterly internal vulnerability scans for a retail business which has hundreds of non-connected locations, which means it's not a centralized location. So a good strategy for quarterly internal vulnerability scans would be, number one is standardization of deployment. And by that we mean, if all the hundreds of locations that are out there are somewhat similar or have few templates, then vulnerability scans could be done on a sample of a bunch of these templates, because any issues found in one environment can be fixed across the board. So standardization is a good method to do that. Another good method, when it's locations that are distributed, would be to ensure that there is a project that is done for PCI DSS compliance, and you are ensuring that no unknown vulnerabilities can seep into this infrastructure, and that could be through things like application whitelisting and ensuring that right logical access control is there beyond the initial deployment. Next question is, how does PCI compliance work? If we failed on a certain question, does that mean we totally failed in getting the certification? And the answer is no. There is the concept of compensating controls. And by compensating controls, it means if you are addressing the risk, basic risk that the question tries to solve, and the risk of cardholder data loss is appropriately protected, then no, you will not fail that, and you can use a compensating control in there. We will take one more question in the interest of time here, and that would be, who are the groups that can benefit from a PCI DSS certification? Is it only vendors that directly touch credit card information, or there are third parties as well? And the answer to that is both. Requirement 12 of PCI DSS talks about ensuring that any vendors that come in touch with cardholder data are appropriately gotten in scope or have their own PCI DSS certification. So it does certainly apply to both your own cardholder data, but it also applies to outside cardholder data from a vendor perspective. We will take one last question as it's coming in. How does the protection of stored data, how to protect stored data using key protection mechanisms? And so there are two components to that. Number one, protection of cardholder data involves two components. One is logical access control, and one is encryption. And both of these need to be in place. From a logical access perspective, you want to ensure only people who need to have access to that data, and not everybody. And that is through the use of access control. When you talk about key protection, even people who might have access to those tables within the database, you want to ensure that the key to decrypt that data, access to that key itself, is restricted outside the chain of people who are managing the databases themselves. And so you want to ensure that the key access is separate from your database administrator access. That was the last question we had time for. We will be sending out a copy of these slides and this recording. Please join us at www.controlcase.com if you have any further questions, if we can help you in your PCI certification or any IT certification, as well as if you want to listen to a recording of either this webinar or any future webinar and past webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. And thank you once again for attending.